Thanks everyone for being here for this session. My name is Hooi. I will go through the slides and hopefully there'll be time at the end for questions. As Dan mentioned, I work very closely with startups in Singapore. I was myself with a startup some time ago. Those were great days. I was young and foolish, and it was exciting times. We went up and we crashed and burned a few times, and I made friendships that I have never lost and I value each day today. So it was a great experience. Today we're going to talk about fundraising. I'm going to illustrate a somewhat simple cap table, and along the way, hopefully, we'll be able to talk about some concepts, some issues that startups may face when going through a fundraising. Okay? Okay, so to set the scene, you and your cousin Jeff decided to start a company. You agreed to have equal shares. That's amongst co-founders, I suppose that's a common fallback position. You've calculated that you need $500,000 Singapore dollars to pay for startup expenses and to launch your first game. I looked at the Casual Connect website, and I understand that the typical cost to launch a casual game ranges between 100,000 US to 500,000 US. So I've put a reasonable number there. You need some cash to start the company, do some incorporation work and so forth. You've approached your Uncle Casey. He's agreed to put in $50,000 to help you kickstart. Okay, so what happens now? You have equal shares with a cousin, and you've got Uncle Casey. Now, this assumes at the moment that Uncle Casey has agreed to take 10% of the company for $50,000. Now, this obviously assumes that the company has been valued at $500,000, right? Because 10% of 50 is 50,000, 100% is 500,000. Now, if you look at the column, the number of shares issued, I've put in some numbers there that are quite large. Now, legally, it doesn't really matter what your numbers are at this stage, the percentages, what you end up discussing with your founders, your co-founders, your investors, and so on, okay? However, the large numbers, of course, help you to splice and dice the shares. Say you wanted to give a first employee 1% of 500 shares, has some difficulty. So the larger the number, the easier that would be, okay? So the company has been, at this point, valued at $500,000. What's the value of the founder stake? So that's easily figured out. Each founder has 45% of 500,000, and that gives us, I think, around about 225,000. So theoretically, immediately, you already have a value of 225,000 in your hand, okay? Now, I've called this the family and friends round. That's what it's often called. Now, why is it often the family and friends round? Now, when you go about fundraising, it's very important to bear in mind your local securities laws. Now, the Securities and Futures Act that I've noted in this slide is a Singapore Act that governs the offer of securities by organizations, right? So if you go out and raise funds, the Securities and Futures Act in fact says it would be a breach of the law, you would be breaking the law unless you fulfill the requirements of the Securities and Futures Act. In general, an offer of securities may attract the need to register a prospectus with the Monetary Authority of Singapore unless the offer falls within the exceptions provided for in the Act. I have put in some of the exceptions in the slide with, some of them are called the small offers exception. This refers to an offer of securities where the entity raises $5 million or less within 12 months. There are other requirements. For example, you cannot have incurred expenses for advertising and other promotional activities. You need to inform the offeree of the offer that there is no prospectus registered in respect of the offer and so forth. So there are a number of requirements, but there are exceptions. So the small offers exception, private placements, accredited investors, and so forth. So be careful when you embark on a fundraising round, and always check with the what the local laws say, right? So in almost every jurisdiction in the world, there are laws that apply to fundraising, so make sure that you don't run afoul of them accidentally, all right? Also, another point I wanted to note is that the terminology and the framework for today's presentation is Singapore law, but those of you who are from a Commonwealth jurisdiction or from the US and so forth will probably find all the concepts similar, okay? So you've got the family and friends round. Good old Uncle Casey has stepped in. He's got 10% of the company, leaving the two founders with the bulk of the company. That's common. You don't want founders to be diluted significantly at this stage. That would not make sense for the investors or for the founders, right? The investors want to make sure that you have sufficient motivation as a founder to build a company for him, okay? Right. What happens next? Now you've spoken to other investors, okay? You've found two investors that are willing to invest in your company for $250,000, $200,000 respectively. They've decided your company is worth $2 million pre-money, okay? They also think you should set aside an employee share option pool, okay? So what does all this mean? Right, now we talked about the $2 million being the pre-money value. So what's the post-money value? That's a simple calculation of pre-money plus amount invested equals the post-money, all right? So that's 2.45 million in this example, okay? We will use this number a little bit later for our further calculations. Now, they also think we should set aside an employee pool. Okay, typically in Singapore, we find that the employee pool set aside usually is 10 to 20%. I suppose it's a matter of market practice. In Singapore, a lot of companies like to set aside 15%. That's a matter of habit. In Singapore, for those of you who are familiar, if you list on the Stock Exchange of Singapore, there is a requirement that your employee share option pool can never exceed 15% of your issued share capital. So 15% has ended up being sort of like the guiding number for a lot of Singapore companies, okay? So that's why 15% is something that you see quite common for Singapore startups, okay? A little bit about this employee share option pool. Very often, the shares that are set aside, we don't issue and allot the shares until the shares options have been vested, have been offered to the employees, accepted, and have vested. Okay, so in essence, the shares don't exist until you allot and issue it. So when you set aside a pool, it doesn't mean that there are shares somewhere out there. They have not been created yet. When you offer it to an employee, they accept, and it's vested, and you allot and issue the shares, that's when they're created. So it's a nominal number that you have set aside, you've agreed with your investors that that is the ceiling number of shares that can be issued to all the employees of a company. Okay? Right, so more mathematics here. The numbers are kept simple because lawyers aren't really famous for being good at math, so I've kept it simple for my own benefit. So we've got two investors. We know that the post-money valuation is 2.45. So simple math again, the person who's invested 250,000 gets about about 10.2% of the company. And the person or the entity that's investing 200,000 gets about 8.2% of the company, right? That's the enlarged pool, right? That is 2 million plus 450,000. That's the enlarged, the post-money valuation. Okay, now, when we say we want to set aside the employee option pool, in this slide, we have made one assumption, which is that the pool is going to dilute the founders, not the incoming investors. That's the assumption made in the slide, right? So you'll see that originally we had 1 million shares, right? When there was 2 founders and Uncle Casey, we've added 250,000 shares, excuse me, because we want to create 20% pool for now. It will be immediately diluted. You'll see in the next slide. We've got 1.25 million shares. You see that Uncle Casey has paid 50 cents for each of the shares. We'll look at the numbers for the other investors later. Okay, you will notice here that yourself, your cousin, and Uncle Casey, your percentage of the company has gone down by 20% each, correct? Because you've created a pool of 20%, right? So each of you, each of the pre-existing shareholders' stake goes down by 20%, okay? Right, so we talked about the employee option pool not necessarily having issued shares. They could be set aside for now, okay? Why do we want to make it clear to our investors that we want to set that aside in the outset? When you sign a shareholders agreement or an investors' rights agreement with your investors, they typically say there's a clause that gives all existing shareholders a right of first refusal over any shares that the company issues subsequent to the investment, correct? So, you want to make it clear from the outset. You want them to agree that you've set aside a pool, and the share options can be issued without having to go to the shareholders for each individual employee's issuance to get their waiver or to get their consent. So you want to make sure that they've agreed in the shareholders agreement. You don't have to keep going back to them each time you want to issue share options to an employee, right? Okay. How do we arrive at 250,000 shares for the pool? Again, mathematically, we have to take into account the additional number of shares in the and add that to the pre-existing shares, and you do the math, and you arrive at $250,000 for the employee pool. Okay. All right. So now we've got the number of shares for the founders. We've got Uncle Casey shares, employee pool. We've got to decide then mathematically how many shares is each investor going to get. Okay. How do we arrive at those numbers? Again, some mathematics. We know that 100% prior to the issue of those shares is 1.25 million shares. We know that the post-money valuation is 2.45 million. So we're simply going to do, the investors' shares on this slide will be the total number to be issued to both investors. So by going around with the ratios, 450,000 divided by 2.45 million has to equal to the total number of shares to be issued divided by the existing shares pool, including employee pool, plus the number of shares you're going to issue to investors, right? So you now know that the number of shares that the two investors will get is 281,250 shares. All right? So how do we arrive at the number for each investor? You look at the ratio of how much they've invested. 200,000 divided by 450,000 times 281,250 shares will give you the number of shares to give to the investor who's invested $200,000, essentially. Okay? I'm going to pause here and ask if there's any questions in case I have, I don't know, missed something. Okay? All right. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question. Can you explain the difference between the employee option pool and the employee pool? Because the employee option pool is a pool of 20% of the company,
muddied the waters and not been clear enough. Any questions at this point? Good, because most of you are probably better at math than I am. Okay, so that's why I ended up being a lawyer. All right. Okay, now, what is the value of the founder stake? Let's go back and have a look at that. We saw from the table that, let's go back to the table, right? So when the shares are issued to investors, you will notice again that all the pre-existing pools, the founders, Uncle Casey, the employee pool, falls by the same proportion, right? Because you're now going to issue 18.4% to the two investors. Everyone else's shares will fall by 18.4%. What is the value of the founder stake now? Well, we know that they now hold 29.4% of the company, and the post-money valuation is 2.45 million. So they own, the stake is now worth about $720,300. Okay, so that in essence really is a very basic look at how we arrive at the numbers and the cap tables and the principles that may govern the issue of the pool and so forth. Now, a fundraising 101 sort of statement to make. Why is the sale of existing shares? Let's say if the founder sells his stake, obviously it's not fundraising by the company because the person selling the stake is the founder, not the company. The company does not receive any additional funds with which to grow its operations. Okay, so I felt that I should point this out because I have sometimes had conversations with individuals who, needed to get past this hurdle before they understood that the sale of their own stake does not in any way enhance the company's share capital. Okay. You'll notice that in the previous slides, I did not talk very much about the type of shares. I just said the number of shares to be issued. Here is where we talk about ordinary shares versus what we call preference shares. So you may have heard the term preferred shares, preferential shares, preference shares. The concept is very similar, all right? They are almost like a quasi-equity come debt. They are shares issued by the company, but they can have certain rights attached to it, unlike ordinary shares, okay? So preference shares can be redeemable, they can be redeemed. The company can pay the shareholder and cancel the shares. The preference shares can be convertible, they can be converted into ordinary shares. They can have a liquidation preference, which means that if the company is sold or if there is liquidation, then the preference shareholder may get a sum of money in preference ahead of the ordinary shareholders, and there could be preferential rights for dividends. In other words, the holder of preference share could enjoy dividend payment over and above the ordinary shareholders, right? So, if preference shares were issued, your cap table might look something like this, where you add a column, and it would say, well, the number of preference shares issued would be that number, and the rest would be ordinary shares. So that was what your cap table might look then. Okay. Now you would see that the price paid by the investors is 160, when Uncle Casey paid 50 cents for the shares. So they've paid about 3 times more. So that should make Uncle Casey pretty happy with that. Okay. And that was my last slide. So any questions?
Is there a guideline for determining the pre-money and the post-money value?
Look, post-money is usually the valuation placed on the company plus the investment. That's post-money, right? It's simple. Now, pre-money, that's the $1 million question, literally, right? What is the pre-money valuation? Look, It's basically whatever the investors are willing to put as a value in your company. They would typically look at your industry, what the valuation has been for similar companies at that stage of its activity, whether or not you have a product, you're in the market, and so forth. So they would try to compare, I suppose, with similar companies at its particular stage of growth, and also look at what people have been investing in terms of the valuation in recent times.
Good.
When a company has revenue, there will be some financial modeling on it, but before then, like I said, it's going to be a question of what everyone else in the market is doing.
So in this example that you used, we have $50,000 from Uncle Casey. The $450 was the money put in?
No. So I'm assuming here that the founders did not put in any cash.
So it's only $50,000 cash from
Correct.
Uncle Casey,
Yes.
and the $450 from the two investors, in this case.
In cash, yes, correct.
So that's a total investment of $500,000.
Well, it's because in the scenario we said they're looking for $500,000 to launch their first
Thank you.
game.
So last question,
Yes.
you talked about preference.
Yes.
What is, in surveying the landscape and the different rounds of funding, and here you're talking about 2 rounds. When do you see kind of the investors looking for preference on their shares versus buying in for common?
Well, I think that in general, the investors who are typically VCs, funds, they typically ask for preference shares. Okay? Now, why do they do that? One of their drivers, and when you deal with a VC or a fund, you have to bear this in mind, that the fund, the VC, they have raised money from their investors. They have gone to high net worth individuals or other funds, such as private equity funds, and they have said to these people, give us some money, we'll invest it in startups. Therefore, they have a mandate with vis-a-vis their own investors, and they would have a fun life. They may have to return cash to their investors within a certain timeline. It could be 5 years, could be 10 years. But when that fund comes to its end, they may have to liquidate their holdings, including their shares in your company, in order to have cash to pay to their investors. So that might be one driver why a VC, for example, would insist or ask for preference shares, so that they, at the end of their fund life, they can redeem the shares, liquidate, and move on.
Hooi, thank you so much. Very important talk. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your time.